Welcome on this fine summer day to Voices for the Future. That is something that Michael Wayne and I started this year. Last year we did Visioneering for the Future and looked at different topics of our society, economics, politics, education, healthcare, things like that. And we were kind of saying what we knew. And then at the end of the year, I said, well, we've told everybody what we know. Let's do interviews and find the intelligence of other people, because we're all putting this thing together. It's going to take everybody on board, contributing their perspective to figure out how we move forward into the future. And so with that, I am so delighted today to have Steve Bhaerman, a dear friend, a longtime associate. I just realized that I first met him in 1987 in San Jose at the New Age Renaissance Fair, where I was scheduled to be on the stage right after him. And I thought, oh my God, is that a hard act to follow? How am I going to do that? And I met him and his wife at that time, and the rest is history. Steve, you're in for an absolute treat with his intelligence and his wit and his depth of understanding politics and society and everything else, but with a wonderful twist that'll make you laugh. He's an internationally known author, humorist, and workshop leader. For 35 years, he's written and performed as Swami Beyondananda, the cosmic comic. And Swami's comedy has been described as both comedy disguised as wisdom and wisdom disguised as comedy. Makes it a lot more palatable when you can laugh it down. Marianne Williamson has called him the Mark Twain of our generation. I think that's true. And on the serious side, which he does have a serious side underneath, he's co-authored with Bruce Lipton, Spontaneous Evolution, Our Positive Future and a Way to Get There from Here. So in Voices for the Future, what better person to interview? With cellular biologist Bruce Lipton. And his new podcast, Front and Center, Writing Our New Story Together, will be launching later this month. And he has been doing something called the Wiki Politiki, where he's also been introducing people. And that's been a podcast. So I've caught some of those that are really good. So welcome, Steve. I'm so delighted to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I have to add that when we first moved, my wife, I first moved to Santa Rosa, to the Bay Area in 1999. We were at the Health and Harmony Festival, and you were on before we were. And I got to experience your workshop on the chakras, and I turned to Trudy. I said, wow, this makes so much sense, so foundational. So it's good that all of these forms of wisdom are weaving themselves together at a time when we could use all the wisdom we can get.
That's right. And back then I was only making cents. Now it's a few dollars, but
we made a few cents back in the day.
It was only cents. Yeah. So I love, your subtitle, Time to Wake Beyond Woke, the Great Upwising. And so say something about the upwising and what you mean by the Great Upwising.
Well, yes, we'll talk a little bit later. We'll talk about my book with Bruce Lipton, Spontaneous Evolution. Essentially, in order for this to happen, there has to be an upwising where we wake up to the illusion of separation, wise up to the power of love and coherence, grow up to become adults of God, as opposed to just children of God, adults of good, even better, and show up on a new playing field, ready to play a new game. So this is my way of playfully extending the the work that Bruce and I did. The book was published in 2009. And at that time, we saw spontaneous evolution as a noun in the future. And now clearly it's a verb in the present. So we created this Upwising as a 4-step plan, which is guaranteed to work 3 times faster than 12-step.
That's great.
Do the math, right?
That's great. And what are the 4 steps?
The 4 steps is wake up,
That's right. You just
wise
said.
up, grow up, show up. And again, first of all, and when I say wake beyond woke, what I'm seeing, my background, I have to make a confession. My background is in political science. Although I never got quite so far in the field as to actually dissect a politician. We never got that far. However, I did learn certain, we won't want to do that, but I did learn certain distinctions that are meta distinctions about being able to look at politics, get off the usual politics as usual playing field, the elephant and donkey show, and begin to look from a higher perspective as to what's really going on. And in my background and looking at this meta politics, I'm seeing that one of the greatest ways of controlling a population is through divide and conquer. So in noticing all of the ways that each of the political sides speak primarily to their side, they create a wall, they create division, they create enmity. And so consequently, we have not been able to gather around the virtues and values that the 90% of us who are not sociopaths would prefer to live by. The golden rule as opposed to the rule of gold. And I'm seeing the new word situation, I'm seeing this situation a lot differently than many of my progressive friends, because I'm very alarmed at this mass vaccination program. I'm very alarmed at the way that alternative points of view, any facts that do not match the facts that fit their narrative, are discarded, deplatformed, censored, et cetera, et cetera. So people who get the facts are only getting certain facts. And this is based on my 50 years experience as a political scientist and my almost 50 years experience in natural medicine that has kept Trudy and I healthy, hospital-free, drug and medication-free into our 70s. And so what I see happening is the institution of a medical monopoly and a deplatforming of the very things that so many people who are on this call cherish, including things like organic food. All of these things are being taken away in a very, slowly but surely as we move toward this singularity, this notion that we're all going to become machines. Sounds like a very dystopian narrative, but that is a potential future, and there's a lot of money and resource invested in bringing that future about. So part of the upwising is for us to wake up, to remember what it means to be human, and what it means to be able to be part of the natural world rather than trying to dominate the natural world.
Right. Yeah.
That's great, Steve, and you're so right on talking about the corporate consolidation, the monopolization, and for you to then as a political scientist with that background to dissect without dissecting, knowing where it's at, but also to wear your other hat of understanding, as you call it, upwising, the hopes for the future. So I'm wondering, what do you see as hopes for the future?
Well, right now, I think that we are really at this crossroads. The program I did last week with Bruce Lipton was called Conscious Evolution, an alternative to mass extinction. So one of the things that we have to be aware of is that we have done so much damage to the natural world that we are on course to weave ourselves out of the web of life. And so part of the multiplicity of emergencies that we face involve 2 existential crises, which are really the same crisis. The existential crisis is, do we want to continue to exist as a species? And if we do, we have to stop looking at how we can dominate nature and how we can create the mental structures that ignore the one of the great teachings of Albert Einstein, which was the field is the sole governing agency over the particle.
That's right.
So Newtonian medicine, which is still being practiced, and it's being practiced to our detriment right now, is all about forces and opposite forces reacting against one another, when in fact the field is really the playing field for new medicine, energy medicine. I want to introduce a paradox, because that's, you know, part of what I do as a comedian is I pump
We only
ironies.
need one doc.
What was that?
We don't need a paradox. We only need one doc.
We need one doc. The paradox. The pumping ironies here. Now, for generations, those who have been developing drugs and treatments have been looking to deal with this very vexing thing called the placebo effect. The placebo effect is about 1/3 of the time when people believe they're being given a healing treatment, they actually get well. And there are statistics that show that the placebo effect works between 25 and 33% of the time. So instead of trying to eliminate the placebo effect, why don't we cultivate it? Why don't we begin to, as children are growing up, how do we learn to use our mental and spiritual capabilities to actually begin to help the body heal itself? Now, you know, in high intervention medicine, I have friends who would not be on the planet were it not for that kind of medicine. So no dismissal of that. However, I'm saying that when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so they're banging away at these things where high intervention medicine does not work at prevention. It does not work at ultimately getting to the field that creates these disorders. It keeps working at the symptoms. And sadly, it's because we have a medical system that's based on money. And so if something can be patented, then it's sold. If something cannot be patented, like energy medicine, you know, you learn how to do it and then you're doing it. You're practicing Qigong or something like that. So the big elephant and donkey, because both parties are involved in the living room, is that we have a system that is based on money, material, and the machine. And all of these people who are trying to do all of these good things ultimately have to come up against, we have to shift the consciousness of the planet, a critical mass of the uncritical masses, from the rule of gold to the golden rule, to being willing to accept that really we are all cells in the same body called humanity, as Bruce Lipton would say, and we need to act accordingly. There's several obstacles that I got to talk about, you know, what the obstacles are. One of them, and by the way, our friends over at the Science and Non-Duality, they've just produced a video on trauma. And it's very, the little pieces I've seen, it's very, very important because it indicates that having lived 10,000 years under the power of the lowest common denominator, since the agrarian societies were overrun by the marauding hoarders, or marauding hoarders, or whatever they're called, marauding marauders, or whatever. We have essentially been in this PTSD. That's part of our DNA. I just read a brilliant article by Tom Hartman that he wrote in 1998, and he was asked to speak to a group of Native American leaders. And with all due humility, he spoke about how 10,000 years ago, the indigenous people of Europe were overrun by the same forces of domination that later wrote the doctrine of discovery, which essentially, as the Pope said, all of these white explorers who came over to the New World, they could do what they will. Those people are not quite human, and so on. So we've been living under this dominator, And it's very, very hard for us to accept that we really can overcome this. So we may believe that there's many, many people working for really good stuff. But if we were to do kinesiology, muscle testing, I believe we can have world peace, doink. We would generally test weak because of that internal programming that has not been confronted. So we have to look at the trauma that has prevented us from fulfilling our humanifest destiny, our destiny as human beings. And we also have to be willing to face the evil that has been involved in manipulating humankind over a period of time, and facing that in ourselves as well, because that's what enables it.
You've written a lot about that in your book too, Michael, the book you've just been working on, and
yeah.
how the economic system just kind of perpetuates this this rape of the planet, and how we're all caught up in that.
Yeah, it's an age-old story, and it's catching up to us in not good ways.
In our old age.
Yeah.
It's an age-old story catching up. But you see, this is a really important point, Michael, because this is what we have to confront. And if we look at the way that we've been handling our problems, like for example, there is a philanthropy industrial complex that pretends to be doing good stuff. What they're really doing is trying to mitigate the awful stuff that's being done on the other side. So, we have how much money has been raised for, let's say, by the American Cancer Association. But when people go to get chemotherapy, they give them sugar to eat without recognizing that sugar is what feeds cancer, right? So we have an entire food system that's largely based on selling poison. And so we haven't yet been able to confront the systemic issue like you're talking about.
All in the name of money, greed.
Greed is good, as
Yeah. So Steve, you and I agree with you 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000% everything you're saying. And you are so unique in the way you try to get the word out, just through what you're talking about now, but also through the integration of humor, and sometimes 100% humor. So I'm wondering how that all came to be. Your Swami Beyondananda persona, or maybe you were born Swami Beyondananda.
I was born Swami and I became.
You also were a Steve. But anyway, yeah.
Probably all of those are true. Cause and effect. I think as we learn about how the universe really works, it's really more about synchronicity and simultaneity rather than cause and effect. But if we want to look at it in a linear way, I was very fortunate to grow up in a family where humor was valued. My dad was a very funny guy. I have a picture of him somewhere when he was in the army, and he's got his hat on sideways and he's in front of a microphone, and there's an audience of people laughing uproariously. No idea what he was saying, but I know he was a funny guy. And so as a kid, I took that on. And the way you know that you're chosen, as the class comedian, it's the first time you're in the lunchroom and you make another kid laugh so hard that milk comes out of their nose. That was the universal sign. So I was that kid, but I did have a career. I graduated from Brooklyn College, went to Antioch Putney, which is a fabulously experimental school. And it was a graduate school in education. They sent me to teach in Washington, D.C. during those times. And so the first thing that I did after spending a year teaching, I started an alternative high school for disaffected kids in Washington, D.C. That got turned into a book called No Particular Place to Go, Making of a Free High School. It was published by Simon & Schuster, that I wrote with my co-teacher and so on. And I was in a career of teaching. Now, I always used humor, but I never, ever, ever imagined that I would be having a career in humor. Something that was so natural in the way that I was, that I never had to try at it. And so I had my dream job. I was teaching auto workers at Wayne State University in Detroit, teaching them labor history and ethnic studies. And a funny thing happened. Now, when a funny thing happens, sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's not. And the funny thing that happened was they needed to place their tenured professors. I was a part-time teacher. I got laid off. And the only job I could get was working for the city of Ann Arbor, departments of parks and forestry, taking down trees that had Dutch elm disease. Now, I'm not making this up. My Jewish mother, bless her heart, I could see she had this concern on her face. What's the matter, Mom? She was afraid that I would catch Dutch elm disease. I said, wait a minute. I said, Mom, people don't get Dutch elm disease. Dogs get it. She goes, dogs get it. She was worried about Buster. She said, what happens to dogs? I said, they lose their bark. So anyway, so I'm working at this job, and it is kind of like a dark night of the soul, because I've been teaching at the college level. I have a book published by Simon & Schuster, and every day I'm getting up and putting on a jumpsuit and a hard hat and chipping brush and so on. And summertime, it was fine. But in the wintertime, cold winter in Michigan, they put a new guy with me, Larry Kelsaw, who it turns out was a brilliant psychologist disguised as a truck driver. And here's a guy who had studied neurolinguistic programming before anybody knew what it was. And so he and I decided to start an underground humorist paper for the guys at the shop. That totally changed the workplace, that created a sense of playfulness and novelty that allowed us to say things that could not be said otherwise. One of the cartoons we did, there was an issue where my partner Larry was Black, and there were no Black tree trimmers. All the Black guys were groundsmen, like I was starting out, groundsmen. And so the joke that we used in the cartoon, the foreman is saying, now look, guys, there's no black and no white at this workplace, just forestry green. Now you light green guys, get up there in the trees. You dark green guys, grab a rake. So we were able to say stuff like that. And I just had a reunion with Larry when we were there 2 years ago. And he said that over the years, because he worked there and retired from there and became a tree expert and did videos on trees and so on. And he said, Foreman Don, and Don was our nemesis. He was always the butt of our jokes, and we were always, wrestling with him. Foreman Don said, Larry said, I got to know him over the years, and Don used to say, boy, I wish you guys were still doing that newspaper. I really missed that paper. So what that project did, long story long, what that project did was it let me know two things. First of all, the power that humor has to change perceptions, change the way we think and see and feel. And number two, I was good at it and I could do it. And so 2 years later, another friend and I started a paper called Pathways, which was one of the first holistic publications. And we knew we needed humor because people took their spirituality seriously. And so Swami Beyondananda was a name that just came to me. I got struck by enlightening during a brainstorm. And, and we decided to use the Swami as our comedy mascot. And he quickly became the most sought after feature in the paper. People always opened up the next to last page to see what the Swami would have to say. And so that's the path I've been on for 36 years officially.
And I've known you 34 of those years. Yeah, that's amazing.
You have, that's amazing, yes.
Yeah, yeah. And you've always had this mix of, political savvy and humor. And it's interesting because right now with humor, and it's and in many, oppressive regimes, it's been the comedians that get to tell the truth. They attack the press and they don't want the press to say what's true, but the comedians can somehow get away with it.
Well, certainly during the Trump administration, that was true. And that was one of the great ways of, resisting that kind of autocracy and blatant gaslighting and so on. But from the bigger perspective, the American people have been gaslighted all along.
That's right.
Our entire lifetime has been a gaslight. From the moment that we took the first Orwellian step in 1947 to rename the Department of War Department of Defense.
Mhm.
And it's been, Kennedy assassination, Gulf of Tonkin, all of this stuff. And unfortunately, the progressive side has not confronted the evil. It was easy to confront the evil of Donald Trump because it was so blatant and such a caricature. But comedians now, I mean, their own, a lot of the comedians won't even go on campus because of this cancel culture. I have a whole routine of jokes I can't tell anymore.
Mhm.
Now, I think it's important that we recognize if there's humor that is hurting other people, that's not the intention of my humor. It's never been the intention. But the political correctness is a lot like the Cultural Revolution in communist China, where everything is so given over to a rigid, humorless, loveless, godless principle that life is squeezed out of the body politic. So if I were on campus today, I would be characterized as a right-wing asshole.
Huh.
But I'm not a right-wing asshole. I'm an asshole, but I'm not a right-wing asshole. By God, I'm front and center asshole, not right-wing, no left-wing or right-wing. But seriously, I think that comedy is suffering now because it cannot talk about the real horrors that are going on other than Donald Trump. So, and on campus, you really can't do that. You can't even talk in quotes. So if I were to say, here's a joke that I would have told 20 years ago without really knowing it, and I would tell that joke, I couldn't tell the joke even talking in quotes. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you can't talk in quotes, then teaching and learning becomes impossible because you can't talk about the past. I cannot tell my story about Lenny Bruce's first appearance in New York. I can't tell that story. Look it up.
That's interested in it.
I can't tell that story because it has a certain word in it. Now, and yet the story is so liberating for all of us because it tells us about how the power of words, how we're influenced by the power of words and how using words in a creative way can break a trance. Okay, so I'll tell the story, even though I can't tell the story. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm going to let the cat out of the room because she's
I'm
driving.
going to let the cat out of the bag. So.
Yeah. And before he starts,
Yeah.
that since you mentioned Lenny Bruce, it made me think that we've almost come full circle in a way because Lenny Bruce kept getting arrested for saying obscene words, all that obscenity, and he kept fighting it so much that it finally opened up comedians and satirists to be able to speak without worrying about being arrested or anything. But now, people aren't, as you say, comedians can't go on campus or they don't want to, and they're not being arrested, but it's like psychic warfare. So anyway, I'll let you tell the story.
But actually, just as a parenthesis, remember George Carlin, the 7 words you can't say? Yeah. You can say every one of those words, but now there's 7 things you can't say. You can't talk about 9/11 being an inside job. You can't talk about chemtrails. You can't speak anything about vaccinations. So we've changed so we can say those words, consequently giving them very little meaning, but we can't speak about the things that are life and death to us. So here's the story, okay? And I apologize in advance to anyone who is going to be offended by this, but I'm going to share the story for a reason. Okay, so Lenny Bruce is doing his first performance in New York, circa maybe 1957 or so. He was very well known on the West Coast. He was at the Hungry Eye, and columnists on the West Coast had talked about this comedian who was very edgy, who was dirty, and breakthrough. So He does his first show in New York. Who shows up? Well, it's all the hipsters, the jazz people, the New York intelligentsia hipsters and celebrities. And right in the front row is the basketball player, Wilt Chamberlain, black basketball player, Wilt Chamberlain, and Sammy Davis Jr. with their dates. And very early on in the show, Lenny Bruce wanted to light a cigarette. Now, in those days, rather than using a match, you would ask somebody to borrow the cigarette so you could light it, right? So he asked Wilt Chamberlain for the cigarette. And Wilt passes the cigarette along. And this is, you got to understand this as a shamanic act, okay? Lenny Bruce looks at the cigarette and says to Wilt Chamberlain, "You've been nigger lipping this." And there's like this, and Wilt and Sammy Davis Jr. burst out laughing, and the whole place comes down, deconstructing that entire concept. So sometimes, in order to deconstruct something, to point out the absurdity of it, in 1957, that was a very radical thing to do. Now how many years later? 64 years later, I can't tell that story. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because of that word. In the midst of all of these things going on, the Black Lives Matter movement last summer, what we did was Trudy went and found the videos of Roots, of the series from the 1970s. And so all you ever need to know is in that. When you see the dehumanization, people losing their history, losing everything, being totally at the effect, it's very easy to watch that and go, wow. I grew up in a Black neighborhood. I thought I knew what that experience was. I don't know. Because I was a white kid. I could leave the neighborhood and do something else. I really was totally watching that series again after 40 years, I was totally blown away by it and how deeply I was affected. So right now, all people need to do is watch that to really get why the Black experience has been what it's been. But they're not going to rebroadcast that because there are certain things that are not appropriate to say now. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's limited how we can learn. And it's limited what can happen on campus. It's become simply a way of simply programming people and preventing other points of view from being heard, not a way to learn or engage.
Uh-huh. So I mean, humor, truth, what you're talking about is truth, and saying it through humor, and you say the truth will set you free, kind of like evolution.
The truth will upset you free. I think that's a better way.
Free. But so what I'm trying to ask is, like, Steve, two things that you're very strong in: humor, and also the whole theme of conscious evolution, spontaneous evolution. So what would you say is the relationship between the two?
Well, first of all, humor, evolution is really about include and transcend. Evolution is include and transcend. What that means is that when you emerge to the next level of understanding about something, you're including what has gone before, and you're transcending to a new level. What humor does is it takes the mind, the duality of the mind, and it allows us to experience that at a higher level. You ever wonder why jokes come in threes? A minister, a priest, and a rabbi are discussing their legacy. How do they want to be remembered? What do they want the eulogist to be saying at their funeral? And the minister thinks, and he says, I want them to be saying that he's a family man and a pillar of his community. The priest said, I want them to be saying he's a holy man and a leader of his flock. The rabbi says, I want them to be saying, look, I think he's breathing. So what humor does is it takes the mind out of the dueling dualities and begins to offer novelty. We created evolution in that workplace in Ann Arbor because we introduced new ways of thinking. We introduced new ideas. We introduced novel ways of seeing things through humor. And then what happened was the people would try to do stuff that would get them in a newspaper. So it initiated so much of that new ways of thinking. So where we are right now is we need to get off the battlefield of this versus that. You know, one of the things that I learned in working with Bruce Lipton and writing Spontaneous Evolution, one of the things, hold on just a second, I have to close the door here.
I'll share a quote from Steve while he's gone. He says it. We asked him to share a quote or phrase that resonates, and he said, "Time to bring left and right, front and center, to face the music and dance together."
Yeah.
I just shared your quote about bringing left.
I
and
thank
right
you. Thank you.
center.
I had to close the door here because Trudy's watching the program. I'm hearing it again. So anyway, my point is that Bruce was saying that in our old way of seeing, we're still in this Newtonian field of this versus that. Yeah. And so much of our discourse, if you look at the polarities in politics, as just one example, rather than creating an include and transcend, which is what I'm looking to do with my Front and Center podcast that I'm doing with Michael McSenty, rather than do that, again, people are on this battlefield of one thing against the other. It's the trans of separation. Humor can break the trans of separation. It shows you a third way. And what that does is that, first of all, there's an aha in the wake of a ha-ha. And then there's an ah as we settle into the heart. We leave the dueling dualities of the head and we put ourselves into the heart of the matter. And so that humor is a tool for creative thinking and bringing new solutions in that are outside the normal ways of this or that thinking. And it's fun.
And it's fun, yeah. And humor also often has something that means two things at the same time that are opposite, and yet it means both of them, and you go, ah.
This happened to me. Yeah, it's kind of like an intentional misinterpretation. You know, I was visiting a friend. She was when I worked at the alternative high school. She was a student, and then a couple of years later, I liked her. I wanted to go out with her, and she told me when we saw her a year ago. She said, "You know, my father was concerned because he thought that you were too old for me." And I said, "Oh, you should have told him, don't worry, Dad. He's very immature for his age."
Yeah.
So you can have an intentional misinterpretation,
right?
That actually brings a level of truth to it. See, that's the other thing about humor. If you're looking at the elements of humor, there's earth, water, fire, and air. Earth is the gravity of the situation. Levity lets you rise above the gravity. Water is the emotion, the irony, the kind of emotional tension. You know, certain jokes about money, sex, politics are more powerful because there's the energy that's there, that's the emotional energy that's there, ready to be liberated. And then there's the fire of surprise. That's the most powerful thing. We laugh in surprise and delight when the mind is tricked into making the wrong assumption, right? We love that. The wonderful Henny Youngman joke. My wife and I were blissfully happy for 25 years. Then we met. So what happens is you're given that first part of the joke, and that's jokes come in threes. So you're the number two, because in making the interpretation of thinking you know what I mean by that, you've jumped to a conclusion. Then the final thing is a trick. Then we met, right? Okay, I was celibate for 14 years, but when I turned 15, I said enough of that. Same kind of thing.
I totally get it. I grew up on Marx Brother movies and Mad Magazine. So
Mad Magazine, exactly. It might be safe to say that you might also have a black belt and Borscht belt.
yeah, and you also, besides the Borscht Belt humor, Marx Brothers and Mad Magazine, you also, in a way, come from that great tradition of the Native American mythology of Coyote as trickster, which is
there's a lot to that. I heard a story years ago about the Coyote, which are the Native American clowns, and there was in Santa Fe, there was this festival going on, a Native American festival, and it's just really in the street there. We've been there. It's like a street fair. And there's one woman, she's very like an elder, a Native American elder. She's wearing a beautiful, beautiful dress and with leather and fringes and beautiful turquoise jewelry and very elegant and stately and dignified. And the clowns, the Coyote, they're breaking watermelons on the street. They're smashing watermelons. And at one point, one of the clowns comes up to her with a watermelon and smears this all over her. And she just burst out laughing, because in that culture, comedy trumps everything. In that it's kind of like Tibetan paintings, Tibetan sand paintings where you go, and it all blows away after that. To remind us of the impermanence of structure. That's what the purpose of that kind of clowning is. That, it's a joke, laugh. Life is a joke, but God is laughing with us, not at us. And so the idea of that kind of trickster being able to trump the greatest dignity that there is, similar to the court jester, being able to tell the king the truth. So that's, there really is something to that, the truth in comedy and so on. There really is something to that. And in that trickster domain, the purpose of comedy, the transformational purpose of comedy, as I see it, is to totally break down the structures that need to be broken down. I like that, the opposite of the neutron bomb, break down all the structures and leave people standing. Yeah. So that's kind of the purpose of humor that I've kind of held. And I want to share one joke. I know people have heard this joke before, but it's a true story. And it talks about the elements of humor and why they're all important. Because I didn't talk about air. And the purpose of air is the truth. Air is the truth, okay? So during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, according to John Kenneth Galbraith, American and Soviet delegates were meeting to discuss the possible trade between the two countries. And when news of the missile crisis hit, everything stopped, and there was tremendous tension in the room. And finally, one of the Soviet delegates very timidly raised his hand and said, "I suggest we each go around and tell a joke." And he volunteered to start. And his joke was, what's the difference between capitalism and communism? In capitalism, man exploits man. In communism, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
And everybody burst out laughing because the jokes hit on 4 cylinders. On the earth level, it really blew up, literally, the gravity of the situation. All of that tension. I may not ever see my family again. The emotion, the water, same thing. All of that emotional intensity liberated it through this laughter. The fire of surprise, where the guy is telling a joke on his own system. And finally, the truth of air, the air of truth, which is essentially beyond all of the isms. We are one in the human heart. That's why that joke was such a transformational moment. So that's the power of humor.
And I love the quote that I think from years ago, how do we change the world about toilet training? Why don't you say that one?
Yeah. We don't need to change. I said, Swami, how do we? There's no need to change the world. If we toilet train the world, we'll never have to change it again.
Right. And it's so true on so many levels. Yeah.
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 I'm sorry for the halo around me. We have light coming in the top here, and I'm not quite sure how to stop the skylight.
Clown chakra.
Okay, so it's okay. I'm enlightened. Okay.
Yes, it's your clown chakra.
And if you believe that, okay.
Well, on a more serious note for a moment, and then we'll open it up to questions, and you can let the Swami answer, or whoever, because I've heard you do that before too. How do you define spontaneous evolution?
Well, spontaneous evolution. We were working with this notion of what do we have to do to make this change, and even 12 years ago or longer, when Bruce and I are writing the book, we're looking at the condition that the world is in, and recognizing that the sixth great extinction is happening, and we're in this transformational situation. And if we look at the markers, if we look at all of the markers of economics, all of these issues, we go, my God, we need a miracle. And there is a template for miracles. There's a template for miracles. It's called spontaneous remission. There are people, and we all know people like this. Maybe somebody like this is on the call. They've had all the medical tests. They're dying. They're sent home to die. There's no hope. And then something happens, and they get well. Louis Mail Madrona, what was that?
My grandmother had that.
Yeah, we know people who've had that. And so generally, the medical system, because it can't patent that, doesn't bother to study it. But Louis Mail Madrona, an MD, wrote a book called Coyote Medicine, and he had interviewed many people who had experienced these spontaneous remissions. And what he found was that the common denominator seemed to be that they all had what was called a change of story. Something about what they were telling themselves about life, about their life, changed. Maybe it was a relationship or a job or a religious system or anything like that. They made that change, and that illness was no longer necessary. So what Bruce and I said in spontaneous evolution is that we need a spontaneous remissioning to change the story that we're telling ourselves from it's every man for himself to we're all in it together. And so the first step is to actually acknowledge that that's the story that we want to tell. Mm-hmm. That's the first step, is to make that story, tell that story. But the spontaneous evolution, again, it builds up over a long period of time, or maybe a short period of time, until a critical mass of the uncritical masses get the idea, and that all of a sudden there is a shift in consciousness where a critical mass of people saying we're headed over there. This is really what needs to spark in order, in the short amount of time that we have to make a change. What needs to spark to create this spontaneous evolution where we recognize we're all cells in the same body called humanity, and that much of what we've been doing is autoimmune dysfunction. And so in order for us to restore health, we have to stop doing those things and use our energy to work together. Instead of the tug of war pulling us apart, a tug of peace where we pull together in the same direction. So in my front and center podcast, the subtitle is Writing Our New Story Together. Mm-hmm. Where there's no vision, the people perish. And we have been suffering from lack of vision, or vision disconnected from the reality of day-to-day living. So it becomes a pie in the sky thing in the future, rather than a feet on the ground thing in the present.
So that's spontaneous evolution, and we can do it with changing the story, and we can change the story with humor. What do you see for the future? And then we'll open up to.
Okay, well, again, I'm seeing there's two kinds of futures. There's many kinds of futures. One is a future that the powers that be in power are looking to take us. And that is the future. I mean, Greg Braden has spoken about this. There's a number of people who have really, how do you want to call it? Alerting people. The British are coming. The British are coming. And alerting people to this top-down imposition that denies our humanity, that wants to turn us all into machines. So unless we acknowledge that, and unless we acknowledge that that's where the power is, there's a lot of power of money and influence that wants to take us there, then we have to, the rest of us, have to really stand for something that is different. One of the things I've had this idea, I may as well share it now. We need a worldwide conspiracy of love.
Yeah.
Now, a conspiracy really means breathing together.
Breathe together.
Right? So what if every hour on the hour, those people who wanted to participate, wherever they are, whatever time zone they are, just begin to breathe consciously, breathing in love and breathing out the love to other people, breathing in all of that, breathing in the spirit that we are, inspiring ourselves with spirit, inspiration. And then what happens is we are actually changing our consciousness every hour on the hour for however long we do it. Doesn't have to be every hour, but we know that if there's people who know about this and people who are doing it, every hour somebody is doing it. Yeah. And the idea of conspiracy is it's an open conspiracy. It's an open source conspiracy. And in that breathing, we're being conscious of the love that we are, the love that we are, and the love that we can express because we bring heaven and earth. There's this wonderful process theology, without going into the whole detail of what it is. It basically says that God is not an interventional God that steps in and says, I'll take care of this now, but a God who whispers in our ear, a God who whispers in our ear through that still small voice that we hear. And so we humans bring heaven or hell based on the choices that we make. And so that's really what it comes down to. It comes down to the individuals. It comes down to, if we can't make the change on the individual level to get off the battlefield and get onto the playing field, then it can't happen collectively. If we do it individually, then it will happen collectively.
And my friend Neil Rogan says we don't need to raise hell to change the world. We just need to lower heaven.
Yes, and I love Neil, and I love his wordsmithing. More people should be familiar with his brilliance.
Yeah. And I love the breathing together on the hour. I once thought that we should have, like, New Year's Day, everybody have sex at the same time, have an orgasm at the same time. It would be the great coming together.
Right now over me. Exactly. Well, that's right.
So Michael, do you have any last questions before we turn it over to the listeners?
Yeah. So one of the things on your website, you encourage people to join the party you've started, the Right to Laugh Party. And I'm wondering if you could, and you talk about we need a new precedent, but I wonder if you could say more about the Right to Laugh Party.
I've had that for years and years, and I may be reviving it. The whole idea is that we need to laugh together, which beats crying separately. Mm-hmm. One big party, everyone is invited, all for fun, fun for all. Bring your gift to share. That's basically it. And recognizing that even though we're going to have disagreements in the head, in the heart, there is the agreement. Charles Eisenstein calls it the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And that's really what I'm looking to cultivate in bringing people together from different sides, that we recognize how much of what we all want is the same. And rather than use our differences to keep us separate, use those differences as a dynamic, as a dynamo to get the best perspectives from all sides.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Steve, because it seems we have such a divide in this country, and part of it is this lack of humor. Especially on the Trump side. Trump had no humor. He didn't do the Al Smith, the politicians' dinner where they get parodied, and so all his followers, I can't say all his followers because that's very general, but it seems like the humor is just lacking there.
Well, I mean, a poisonality like Donald Trump doesn't have humor. That kind of poisonality has no sense of anybody else, any other human being whatsoever. So in order to have a sense of humor, you have to be able to relate yourself to other people. So he only sorts by, are you with me or against me? So that's not a criteria for actually looking at the subtleties in life. So there's no sense of humor there. But believe me, there is no sense of humor on the woke campus. Mm-hmm. There is no sense of humor. So I think it's important that we recognize that tyranny is an equal opportunity employer, and there's left-wing tyranny that in some ways is more dangerous than right-wing tyranny right now because it's invisible to the progressive side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on that note, Brandeis University recently, I don't know if you heard about that, their certain organization on campus, administrative office, put out 100 words that will not be allowed to be said on the Brandeis campus. In that day, I don't know if you heard about that, but
no, I hadn't. But why is it not surprising to me?
Yeah,
I mean, it's another level of fascism, and I think it's very important. Here's something that's really, really awful. My friend Mark Crispin-Miller, who's been teaching propaganda studies, teaching course on propaganda at NYU for many years, because he was talking about, as an example of propaganda, what we're being told about COVID. He mentioned masking. This is back a year ago, and he said, let's look at what people are, alternative points of view, and let's dissect this. And one of the students took exception to that, and basically his class was suspended for hate speech. Okay, so right now the people who are questioning any aspect of this mass vaccination program are being deplatformed as hate speech. If you've ever seen Green Med Revolution, Sayer G, if you know Sayer G, he has been accused of hate speech. So I think it's really important to recognize this is a very serious thing, more serious than Trumpism, because at least he's on the outside of the tent pissing in now. But the people who are on the inside of the tent, it's very important that we recognize that level of fascism, because that's what's going to do us in quicker than Trump.
And we can do it to each other. Let's open it up to some questions from the listeners. And you can answer as Steve or you can answer as Swami. But I know you're just really good thinking on your feet. And if anyone, you can type it into the chat. This is a webinar, so we don't actually have the capacity to have you speak. That's so we can broadcast it on Facebook. But type your questions into chat.
The Q&A box.
And while we're waiting for that to come up, what other words do you want to leave us with about looking at the future?
Well, let's see. The future is a choice. The future is a choice, and what I've learned over the past period of time in having to look at some darkness in my own life and ways that I've been and having to face aspects of the shadow. What you recognize is that at some point you're either below the line or you're above the line. Below the line is the battlefield. Below the line is where you're going to actually spend your energy fighting what you don't want. Above the line is where you actually come together and begin visioning and working for what you do want. So every day, if we look at how are we apportioning our energy, the future that we're living into is a matter of choice based on where do we spend our energy? Do we spend our energy arguing with people on Facebook who we don't agree with? trying to convince them or try to make ourselves feel right? Or do we engage with people who are on the playing field and are looking to activate the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, regardless of whatever political or spiritual or religious or ideological camp they happen to be coming from? The dehypnosis has to do with engagement.
That's right. Yeah. And listening.
And listening.
Yeah, the emerging butterfly emerges on a right wing and a left wing, actually, and can't
Exactly.
fly on only one. So it's coming back into our core and our
and it's very dangerous. I mean, I'm watching I have a friend who posts cartoons on Facebook, and she's of a progressive bent. And there was something that was posted about it's good that Republicans aren't getting vaccinated, more of them will die. Something like that. And then all of these things about agreeing with them with that statement. And so I posted a piece saying, I think it's really important to take a look at some of these progressive websites that have started to wake up about the missing and misinformation about vaccinations and COVID. And I listed some websites. Well, one woman, I couldn't believe she wasn't a Russian troll or something. The way she, the hateful, this is a progressive, quote unquote.
Yeah.
The hateful, vile. I didn't take it poisonally, but I was really concerned that people have been so thrown into fear that they've allowed themselves to speak to other human beings that way.
Yeah.
It ain't just the Trump people, believe me.
No, it's in the culture. It's in the culture. It's a culture of
Yeah.
hate, and the hate is like a virus that's been let out of its lab, and it's spreading rapidly, and it's a big concern.
It starts
any
with fear.
questions from anybody on, please ask Swami some questions. He's brilliant at answering them.
Yeah, he's wonderful for questioning.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to know more about your work or hear more from you, what's the best way to do that, Steve?
You can go to wakeuplaughing.com or frontandcenter.us. Frontandcenter.us.
Center.us. That's your podcast.
Yeah, that's the podcast that we'll be launching right after the 1st of August.
Oh,
and still doing Wiki Politiki?
We suspended. There's only a certain amount that I could do. So all of the Wiki Politiki interviews we've done, let's say, probably 150 of them over 3 years. They're all on wikipolitiki.com. You can listen to them for free. There's a lot of really wonderful luminaries that have been interviewed on that show, and
yeah, there are,
and breakthrough ideas that people need to be exposed to.
Yeah.
Oh, right. And do you still have your blog, News from the Trail?
I put that out every month or so. It's funny. I've been working on a post for 2 months, which is not like me, but it has to do with the pandemic and so on, and looking to at what's the most useful way that I can communicate where I'm at with it, how I've learned what I've learned, and not impose that on other people, and yet stand up for my own right as to what goes into my body and what doesn't. And so that's been, I'm writing it, but it's been a very challenging piece to write because there's so much nuance to it, and I want it to be effective, and I wanted to help people make a breakthrough in their own way of thinking about this, regardless of whether they've had the vax or whether they want the vax. A lot of people, it's certainly one way to deal with this pandemic, but I'm looking at it from a bigger point of view, and I see medical totalitarianism as a real issue, and that many of the, over the years, many holistic practices have been deplatformed and accused of quackery. And when you start to go beneath the surface and do some research, you find that it's likely that something is called quackery because it does work than because it doesn't. And it challenges the current system. People are familiar with the Rife machine. People are familiar with the Gerson cancer therapies. All of these things were driven underground because they worked. And we're having the same thing happen right now.
Yeah, it's and more so than ever, it's needed. I work as an acupuncturist, I know precisely. And I've said all along with the pandemic, the biggest problem really is the poor health, especially how it's hit this country, the poor health of the American populace. We were ripe for the picking for some sort of virus to come along and create havoc.
Exactly. And you know, if you look at remember the presidential debates in 2019, Marianne Williamson began to bring this up. She began to bring up the idea of, you know, here we are, we're talking about healthcare and solving the problem, but why are people so sick? Shut down immediately, because our entire economic system, or a large part of it, is based on creating poisons. Poisoning the air, poisoning the water, poisoning the food, and then creating poisonous food that a friend of mine was just in the hospital, and the hospital's food is not changed. It is not evolved.
I know, it's terrible.
It's still 90, you know.
You come out of surgery and there's a red meat steak and a cup of coffee and a sweet piece of pie on your tray when you come out of surgery.
Exactly. You know? Total unconsciousness, but there's more, but to really go beneath the level of unconsciousness, there's a concerted effort to keep things the way they are.
Yeah, well, it's all, you know, going back to the political discussion, it's all, and our economic, it's all based on the gospel of the GDP. It's all about growth, and the healthcare sector is a big contributor to GDP, and so it's a
isn't that ironic? I mean, if you think about how much, you know, GDP is like the total amount of money that's spent, and if you're spending money to remediate toxicity, if you're spending money to clean up stuff that never should have been spilled in the first place, how smart is that? Yeah. You know, so the Swami says, "Hey, if we lose the earth, there goes the GDP."
Yeah, and taking some herbs or meditating, especially, is not good for the GDP. Good for health, but it doesn't.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really interesting that they're attacking Dr. Mercola for making money, you know, on his website, where he's trying to educate people about holistic health. Like, that's a bit like, it's okay when the drug companies do that, but when somebody like Mercola, he's obviously an opportunist. So I think we really, really need to develop three things. Okay, first and foremost is a connection with the divine that's our own. We're in this so-called civilization, we're mainly all hungry ghosts because of the lack of connection we've had with our mother, you know, because of being taken away from this natural sense, you know, and some indigenous cultures, you know, children are still hanging on their mothers at the age of 4. So there's an entire thing that gets transmitted through the chemistry and through the energy field of the mother that creates a sense of security and connection. You know, in the indigenous people,
antibodies in the breast milk,
the antibodies in the breast milk. And so all of these things are factors. And Michael, what you talked about, that we're not a healthy population, and most of what's going on that is perpetrated by the mainstream media, et cetera, is designed to make us less healthy, and then kind of accuse people around the edges of being fat and all this other stuff. So it's kind of like a way of playing both sides, but not really changing everything. So number one is having a connection with spirit, an individual connection with spirit, whatever we call it. The power of love. And that has been, I would say, the most important thing in my life and in Trudy's life over the past bunch of years, is having that connection and recognizing that whatever happens on this physical plane. There is that field of love. New book out by my friend and associate, Bruce Grayson, about near-death experiences that he studied for 40 or 50 years, called After. And it's a physician's look at what these near-death experiences can teach us. And the people who return from these generally report that there is this field of abiding love. Their life is changed forever, and the lives of people around them are changed forever. The people are no longer, not only are they no longer afraid of death, they're no longer afraid of life. Mm-hmm. And the most dangerous thing to the current materialist power structure that has created so much fear of death around this so-called pandemic is recognizing that, you know what, life is bigger than that. Reality is bigger than that. And once you release your fear, then you're much better able to see the bigger picture around you. Laughter is another way of doing that. Laughter and playfulness. Laughter and playfulness is the second thing. And finally, be willing to question what you're being told. Just be willing to wonder. Be willing to wonder. If you're somebody from another planet and you come down and you look at what's going on, what would you conclude about what's going on in this world? If you had nothing at stake and were just an observer, what would that look like? And I think that that's how we cultivate the spiritual maturity that's required for us to make the transition to the future that we all want to live in.
Yeah. So we have a question from Mark on humor, but on humor and evolution. Mark asked, or 3 questions. Is there a higher sense of humor? How does the individual sense of humor evolve? Is humor itself evolving?
Wow. Okay, well, I think we can probably extend this for another 90 minutes, I'm taking, right? Okay, that is such a good question. Oh my God. Okay, so give me the first, part 1 was what?
Is there a higher sense of humor?
Yes, the higher sense of humor is, I've created this whole thing about the fool's journey and fool realization. And true fool realization is to hold awareness and innocence in the same space. So if you look at people like the Dalai Lama, Maharishi, Swami Beyondananda, all of these evolved people, their laughter is about recognizing the cosmic joke. The cosmic joke is that we have all of the tools inside of us to create this unity, and yet we've created this separation to create this battlefield and game to play so that we would have something to do. When in truth, we're all unified. It's all one thing. And so those who can see from that bigger picture have that deeper sense of humor. So when people have had the life experiences that have given them wisdom, and what they're laughing at is they're not laughing out of fear. It's not a nervous laugh out of fear, but they're laughing out of love. They're laughing because their joy is bubbling over. That's the higher sense of humor. A sense of humor evolves when we ask ourselves the question, what's the purpose of this? Am I doing it to hurt somebody, or am I doing it to create a bridge between people? Am I looking to blow up an idea that needs to be blown up, even if people are uncomfortable with that, and I'm willing to live with that discomfort? Or am I simply taking a cheap shot at somebody because everybody else is bullying them? I don't do comedy clubs. I've never done comedy clubs. And it's for the reason is I don't like the comedy that's generally done in comedy clubs. Mm-hmm. Because it puts people back on that field where if you're sitting up front, you're going to be insulted. And I don't do that. So the higher view of, so is comedy evolving? In a certain way, it can evolve, but I don't see in terms of the comedy that people are digesting, I don't see it evolving. I see that, yeah, and again, in every generation, there are people who've got it all. They've got the humor and they've got the depth of wisdom and understanding. So I'm sure that there are comedians who are coming up now who have that. But if you're working in the domain of political correctness, it's really, really hard to speak the truths that will really elicit the energy that comes from liberating pain from through laughter.
Yeah. And then how does the individual sense of humor evolve?
The individual sense of humor evolves from being more on the field of love than the field of fear. And so the humor that you're sharing is ways of building bridges to people, rather than blowing those bridges up. Playfulness. One of the things that I teach in my humor classes, commit random acts of comedy. How do you bring playfulness to the world at large? So years ago, I was at Whole Foods, and they had just started cooking chicken pot pies. So I looked at the woman behind the thing there, and I figured it was okay. And I said, "Excuse me, I have a question. The chicken pot pie, exactly how much pot do you use?" And she looked to see if anybody else was looking, and she said, "Not nearly enough." And so that was a joke that we shared that changed her mood, changed her day. So anybody can do that in changing people's energy through uplifting the corners of their mouth in laughter or smiling. So we evolve our sense of humor by allowing ourselves to come out and play and look for ways that we can bring out the playfulness and love in other people.
Beautiful. Wonderful. Yeah. Oh.
Well, without any more questions from the audience, I think we can give this a wrap. You
want to wrap? Okay. You got
a final wrap you want to share with us? You want to give us a little taste of Swami?
Yes. Okay. This is Swami's rap song. Ready? I am the Swami, and I'm here to say the purpose on the planet is to laugh and play. If everyone lived life this way, we'd bring about non-judgment day. Imagine a world without judgments. We'd all win beauty contests. Beyondananda is my name. Fundamentalism is my game. Everyone gets transcendental when the fun comes before the mental. You want this truth to come across? Clear your mind with mental floss like this. Back and forth twice a day. You'll prevent truth decay. There you have it.
That's beautiful. It's a wonderful note to end on. And thank you so much for bringing your lightness, your levity, your gravity, your four elements, your wisdom, your humor, all of it to our audience. And again, how people can find you. You've got Front and Center US, frontandcenterus.com.
No, it's frontandcenter.us. It's a whole other domain.
Yeah,
frontandcenter.us, wikipolitiki.com, wakeuplaughing.com, wiki, W-I-K-I, politiki, P-O-L-I-T-I-K-I. And that's where you can see many of the things I've written on politics and interviews with solutionaries and evolutionaries.
Wonderful. And of which you are both. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you too for doing what you're doing, and hope to see you on the fun way.
All right. On the fun way.
All right.
Namaste and namasko.
All right. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Till later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.